Welcome to the Wild Ag Podcast, where we'll serve as a connection point for landowners and conservation professionals who want to integrate conservation and agriculture. I'm Dr. Andrew Little, Professor of Landscape Ecology and Habitat Management and Extension Specialist at the University of Nebraska.
And I'm Nate Pfluger, Precision Ag Coordinator for Pheasants Forever and an avid outdoorsman with friends and family in my free time. Together, we'll work to bring you perspectives from both landowners and conservation professionals for discussions on soil, water, and wildlife in ag-dominated landscapes.
Welcome back to the Wild Ag Podcast with our co-host Nathan Pfluger and myself, Dr. Andrew Little. Today we have the opportunity to speak with Luke Meduna, who is the Big Game Program Manager for Nebraska Game and Parks Commission. We're going to chat a little today about Nebraska deer management and Nebraska's river antlerless season. Thanks, Luke, for joining us today. You want to give a little introduction, background about yourself?
Sure. Thanks for having me. Name's Luke Meduna. I'm the Big Game Program Manager with the Game and Parks Commission. I've been in this position for 6 years now. Prior to that, I worked out in North Platte for 6 years as one of the field biologists in the management section. I managed about 12,000 acres of public land out there. Really enjoyed it. North Platte kind of became a second home for me. And then prior to that, I actually spent another 6 years, 6.5, in Rapid City, South Dakota, where I worked. I was in charge of doing all the wildlife surveys for about the western third of South Dakota. And then when I wasn't busy doing that, I was helping on all sorts of research projects, helping catch mountain lions and deer and elk and mountain goats, and doing all sorts of fun stuff that a young wildlife guy would love to do. So, and that's really where my experience in big game really came, was doing all of that stuff.
That's cool.
Did you have a path that you wanted to take? Did you know you wanted to do big game management prior to those experiences?
No, I had always I had worked some temporary jobs out in the Panhandle where I had done management section stuff, which included land management as well as some big game work. And then it just kind of, that was the direction my career kind of took me, was doing more big game. But I had always kind of envisioned myself as one of those management section biologists managing public land, doing that type of stuff. But then over time, I came back and actually did that work here in Nebraska, there in North Platte. But my interest was still, I came back and then I was still, analyzing harvest data and stuff and, wading into all that, even when I probably shouldn't have been. But
good experience anyways.
Oh, yeah.
So obviously, as the big game program manager, there's numerous big game here in Nebraska, but today we're going to focus specifically on deer management, as Dr. Little mentioned. What goes into managing Nebraska's deer population? Probably a loaded question.
Yeah, well, there's a lot that does go into that. One of the big things we look at that we manage off of is really social tolerances. We're trying to kind of manage in that window of keeping the deer numbers low enough that our landowners are fairly happy, and keeping the deer numbers high enough that our hunters are happy, and kind of staying within that window largely, when we can. There's sometimes those tolerances overlap, and so we got to try to find those balances, because being in a state that's 97% privately owned and heavily, agriculture, we've got to be respective of that and work with. If we lose landowner support, there's nowhere to go, and that's where the wildlife live. So
yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and landowner support has been a reoccurring topic here in these episodes, just like you said, with Nebraska being privately owned. How do you guys gauge the social tolerances? Are you going on social media? Do you host gatherings for people to come and speak? How does that work?
Yeah, so every winter we have in each of our administrative districts, which now there's 5 of them in the wildlife division. We try to host 2 public meetings where landowners, hunters, general public can all come. Those will actually be coming out. We're working on getting those all set up. Typically those are in December and January. So we'll have 10 of those meetings this year, and then I also do 2 Zoom meetings. So we'll have a total of 12 public meetings that we do. So we get input from that, but it's kind of a constant thing throughout the year of how many depredation complaints are we getting from landowners on deer during the growing season? How many damage control permits did we issue compared to previous years? And then also, what are the hunters saying? What are we hearing, in that regard? And so it's, there's some kind of official times when we take that input, but there's also, it's just a constant, what did we hear from, Dave that we talk to 3 times a year or twice a week, because we all have those contacts throughout our life. And so we've all kind of got an ear to the ground, all the time trying to figure out what the general sentiment is of it. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it's obviously you're trying to manage at a state scale. And as you mentioned, 97+% privately owned, and properties from eastern Nebraska to western Nebraska look quite a bit different. And so obviously you guys have management units that kind of help with some of that and allocation of permits and such. But yeah, it's always probably a challenging thing at a state level trying to manage. So. Yeah,
it can be difficult, and but having areas separated out with our management units sure helps, because it helps us compartmentalize everything.
Absolutely.
And because sometimes things can be drastically different. Obviously unit to unit, but even within units, and 10 miles down, up and down one river, you might have great differences. So it's always trying to work through all of that.
Yeah.
So even though you are managing populations based largely off social tolerances, are you still trying to determine populations in a certain way?
We do, like when we're asked, we've got some really rough formulas on how we would estimate, our populations based upon buck harvest, which, really that comes down to, okay, what's the breakdown of bucks, does, and fawns? What percentage of the bucks are we harvesting? And for whitetails, it really, if you do the math, it comes out really pretty close to just multiplying the buck harvest by 10.
Strangely, for total harvest?
Yeah, and so for total buck harvest, when you run all that math through, it's pretty close to, if we had 20,000 whitetail bucks harvested, that means we probably have about 200,000 total whitetail deer, And so when you figure, the, buck doe and fawn ratios, and, if we're shooting 25% of the whitetail bucks on the landscape, and just that, it's a really rough way of doing it. And but when you break it down, it's like, that's actually not terribly far off, and one of the reasons we don't operate off of, specific population estimates is because those are really hard to get, especially whitetail deer. It's something across the United States. States really struggle getting accurate estimates of whitetail deer. And there's some states that put a lot of value in those estimates, and they're constantly fighting with their hunters and their landowners saying, oh, no way, we've got way more than that, or we don't have near that many. And in the end, you still have to have that conversation of, okay, we've come up with this estimate. What number do we want to have? And that's where that social tolerance fight happens. And so we kind of skip the expensive step of going, well, we have, 192,386 plus or minus 50,000.
And at the end of the day, I think taking input from the landowners is, the way to go anyways, right? Instead of calculating it in a way and then telling somebody, right? Say, hey, what are you seeing out there? That has to build a better relationship, I would think.
It does. And that's, but there's a lot of work that has to, go into maintaining that relationship, and that ebbs and flows, all the time. And so it's been we've put a lot of staff effort into trying to work with landowners these last few years, because I think we realized we had gotten kind of lax on that side of it, in the late 2010s, so these last few years, it's been a major emphasis.
Well, that's good to hear.
Well, I always hear that message that, a lot of the biologists out there doing a great job at engaging with landowners. And so obviously like you said, it takes that one-on-one connection with them to hear what they're saying. And then, like you said, you're kind of building it within those units. So you guys have your management units for those permit allocations each year. I'm curious. So with the permit allocation process, and you mentioned about like with the numbers trying to estimate that, and that makes total sense. You're getting the feedback during those winter meetings, and then you guys, or do you kind of meet as an agent, like the agencies within regions or within those units, to then decide how many permits? Like, what's that process kind of look like?
So each year, of course, we have all of our public meetings, but each of our district staff, the districts will all have a meeting where they actually throw the invite out to all of our divisions. A lot of law enforcement comes and participates. We get a few park staff that come to those, but we get the input from our, wildlife division field staff, the conservation officers, and whoever else within of our staff that wants to participate. They'll kind of have a meeting, kind of go through each permit and say, hey, this is kind of where we're at. This is what happened last year. What are your thoughts? And allow staff to provide input, or at least we try to make sure that everybody gets that opportunity. And then our district managers in the management section, they compile all that. Have some more discussions with a few of the staff that are a little more involved, and then they will bring the recommendations that come out of each district to a meeting that we have with a more select group. It's got our wildlife administration and some of our program managers and the district managers and a handful of biologists. There's and a couple law enforcement. There's 15 people probably in that group, and we spend about 3 days and go through every permit, deer, elk, antelope, across the state, and just discuss, like, is this, what do we want to do with each one? So each permit gets reviewed annually. And so we take a look at all of them.
No, and that's, I guess, to kind of add to that, that's great to kind of share to people, because I think that sometimes people are like, well, how do you just pick numbers out of a hat, or how do you guys do that? But it's obviously a very thoughtful process, as you just described, and having 3 days when you're meeting and kind of going through these different species. Like, it's not, it's a process, and to make these educated, decisions on what we want to do. So that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
In that group that we have that meets together, we'll often, like, starting in December, we'll start having, a couple of Zoom meetings, once a week or once every other week, just so that we don't just try to cram it all into 3 days. So we can kind of start bringing, if there's a big issue that maybe needs a big change, we don't want to just, like, stumble through it in 3 days. Here you go. When it's at the end of it, we want to kind of brainstorm and be thinking about it all year. And so we can really refine those ideas and hopefully come up with a workable solution for some of that.
Even working on stuff year round, like you're mentioning, that has to be a grueling 3 days going through everything.
Yeah, 3 days, and we're with 15 or 20 of us crammed in a room. We're kind of tired of each other by the end of the 3 days. But for the most part, we all get along really well. So, or maybe I'm the oddball out that they all don't like me and they don't tell me, but. No, we get along really well, and it's a good group of staff that works together on that, and we've all kind of got a common goal and common interests in it all, and professional enough to work through all of the differences.
When it comes to adjusting the permit numbers each year, are you taking into account fatalities that aren't related to hunter harvest? And if so, how is that kind of determined?
We try to, whether it's through some different research projects that we have. Or, in years like these last few years where we've had drought, when we've get more EHD reports, the hemorrhagic disease reports, that weighs into what we're looking at, and or at least that clues us into a direction that our population is going, so that if we need to reduce antlerless harvest or antlerless permits, then we've got some reasoning behind that. If we need to target a little bit lower antlerless harvest, that helps into it. Unfortunately, it'd be great if we had deer collared in every unit of the state. Unfortunately, those types of projects are rather expensive, and so those projects tend to be just short-term snapshots. Hey, this is kind of what's going on in a normal year. We are in the process of we've got one mule deer project going on right now out west, and then we're kind of exploring the options of looking at a whitetail project, in the next few years in the eastern part of the state, because it's been 15 years since we've had a collar on a whitetail, going all the way back to about 2009.
Wow.
Well, and to that point, that's, you can't obviously collar all the deer out there. And even like you mentioned about, like, estimating the numbers, I think that's something a lot of folks may not necessarily know that process, and it can be very complicated, and it's an estimate, and because we can't go out and just count, individual animals, because they're, it's not possible to do that.
Yeah.
It's obviously a little complicated process, and it's an estimate, and there's going to be error with that. It's not going to be perfect, but I like that approach that you guys have. I think that makes a lot of sense. So
the population estimates, especially whitetails. I mean, anybody that's been sitting in a tree stand the last 2 weeks when they're the most active they ever are, they're really hard to find now. Try doing it from a helicopter and an airplane. Even with no leaf canopy or anything like that, it's really tough. Spotlights from the side of a road at night. There's some states that can do that, but there's all sorts of stuff that goes into that makes those confidence intervals get really wide really quick.
Yeah.
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 So outside of research focusing specifically on your muleys or the upcoming stuff for the whitetails, what data do you collect each year that helps you in managing the populations?
Okay, so at our specifically like at our check stations, we're in the check-in process. If you're doing it through telecheck, we look at the sex and the age. Male, female, adult fawn. On the box, we ask that inside spread, of greater or less than 11 inches, which conveniently separates. If it's less than, it's more than likely a yearling buck, and if it's greater than, it's 2+. That was through some research out of UNK about 10 years ago now, and that number works really well. Or if it's check stations where we're working, we cut the cheek open and age, looking at the tooth wear and replacement. We also get the county that the deer was harvested in, the unit that the deer was harvested in, number of days hunted. Yeah, if it was on a public area, what weapon that they would have used, for firearm, archery, crossbow, muzzleloader, that type of stuff. And then in select times or select areas, we do some disease sampling like CWD. So it's fairly extensive. It's not a huge list. When our season started out, the list was like 19 different things. Like for bucks, It was like number of points and weight of the deer and the lactation status of does and all sort of. It was really involved. Of course, that was when we were only shooting like 300 deer off of Halsey, and so it was pretty easy to do. Now when it's we're not that as not quite that invasive with our requirements. So.
I did not realize that. That's a lot of information to be bringing in.
Yeah, there were 19 different points of data they're getting from each deer. So
then you mentioned disease. So obviously we have rifle season starting here just in a few days. So you guys will be sampling for CWD, I assume, and what parts of the state? I know you kind of I think rotate that a little bit, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct. Yeah, this year we are sampling in the Loop East, Elkhorn, Missouri, Wahoo, Blue Northwest, Blue Southeast units. That's part of our 3 to 5 year annual rotation around the state, just where we're trying to sample just to gauge a prevalence rate for CWD, sure. Within that targeted sample of deer. And it's mostly oriented just around trying to detect CWD within each of the units or counties, and just trying to see where it's expanded to and just track that over time. It's not a super specific survey, it's got fairly wide confidence intervals to it, but it helps us, keep a trend over time and just see how which obviously constantly expanding its range and slowly climbing up in prevalence, which that's kind of the name of the game with CWD across the nation. So.
Yeah.
How do we stack up amongst other states as far as disease prevalence here?
Oh, well, comparing to all the states east of us, we're definitely higher. We're one of the very early adopters with CWD. I believe it was either 2000 or 2001 when we first detected it out in Kimball County. And so it's, we've been doing this game, a long time. And so a lot of the eastern states, it's a new disease to them. But for us, it's, I'd say socially or even staff wise, we've kind of like, well, it's here. We've had it. This is what it's doing. There's not a lot we can do, not that we're entirely complacent about it, but we've kind of, our enthusiasm for it has waned, and with our hunters too, it's so.
So that seemed to have started in western states, and it's moving east.
Yeah, it's slowly. The first detection of it was there at Fort Collins, and so Colorado, Wyoming Front Range area, and it's just kind of slowly expanded from there. And of course, it had gotten into the captive cervid industry, and that got moved around. Of course, hunters also, kill a deer out west and take it, home and process it and all that stuff. So, it's got moved around a number of ways.
Yeah.
And most I can't remember, 26 or so states in the nation have found it.
Yeah, I know Georgia here a couple of years ago, they got it. So, right in that kind of southeast area. I know like Alabama has been dealing with it. Of course, Mississippi, I think they just had detections here in the past couple of years similar to that. So, yeah.
Well, and to note that, I think it's important to clarify that it's going to come across state lines. I mean, just through population movement, right? I mean, there's nothing that we can do to stop it or.
Yeah, there's not been a lot. that's shown successful, whether, reducing populations or all of that. So yeah, it's a struggle that way, and kind of a drain on, I always refer to it as kind of just a, small hole in the bucket, for it's just that constant drip, drip, drip. That's hard on populations. But it's, it's not the catastrophic, things that we see like with EHD, but it's just that constant hole in the bucket that, you've only got so many thumbs to put on.
So one change you guys have this year, so you're moving to you still can check your deer in during the rifle season, I should say. You still can check your deer in, but you also have telecheck. Am I mistaken on that, or is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, we're historically, so about 2010-ish, we started with the telecheck. Prior to that, every deer that got killed had to go to a check station. We then opened up telecheck for archery and muzzleloader seasons, just partly because finding a place that's open from 8 to 8 from September, at that point, September 15th, all the way to the middle of January, was rather difficult. We also found that, those hunters adopted that really quick. We did keep our November firearm as the in-person check stations, partly so we could have that interaction with hunters, also so we could get the disease samples and get the age data. There's been a growing tenor from our hunters, like, why don't you guys do check station or do telecheck for November firearm? That's been growing for, a handful of years. Of course, in 2020, when everything was closed and shut down, our check stations were closed. We did telecheck, and our hunters responded greatly. We actually had more deer checked in 2020 than 19 or 21.
Oh, wow.
So, our hunters, adopted it really quick. Of course, then we go right back to check stations in 21, and everybody's like, well, what are you doing? The other thing that we've found these last few years post 2020 was that the places, gas stations, and most of them were hosted, a lot of them were hosted at gas stations, convenience stores. They are finding it harder to hire staff. There's fewer staff for them, so they can't staff these for us. And it used to be we'd have a turnover of like 2 or 3 every year statewide out of the 100 to 115 check stations we have. These last like 3 years, it's been between 10 and 15 turning over that we've got to find, which means, and so, our district managers are running around trying, it's some of these towns, they're hosted in people's houses because they're just like, well, we want to have one in our town. So we got some people that are nice enough to be like, well, I'm going to sit home all week and I'll just check deer. And so it's been really part of the reason that we're switching over. Obviously, our hunters, adopted it very readily and have been asking for it, but it's also been a real struggle for us to keep check stations open. Just the burden that it puts on hunters. There's parts of the state where we actually did a GIS analysis of it. The drive time to get to a check station. There's some parts of the state where it's a 90-minute drive to get to a check station. Like out in the Sandhills. Most of this, a good part of the state is like 40% is a half hour or more to get to a check station. And that's a significant burden that we're asking of our hunters. And we know that there's some hunters that are like, I'm just not checking it in because I'm not going to make that drive, And so hopefully that allowing telecheck fills in that gap.
Sure. Yeah.
So, and one of the cool things with the new permit system that we've got with that telecheck is there's actually a QR code. I don't know if you've looked at your deer permits, but there's a QR code on there that if you scan it with your phone, it actually goes straight to the telecheck website and has your permit number already entered in the little line. And so that you don't have to, it's a D and then 3 zeros and a 2, you don't have to go through all that. It's already in there, and you just select the species and hit select, and then you're off to the races to get it done. So it's really slick. It's really cool.
Yeah, that is nice. Growing up in eastern Nebraska, it always seemed like those check stations were fairly close, right? There were a few that you could choose from. So I never thought of that in western Nebraska. And honestly, when I was younger, it was exciting to go check your deer in, because then you get to see what everybody else shot. And like you said, you're sharing stories. Hey, what'd you guys see out there? And it was almost like a camaraderie type thing. At least when I was little, that's how I viewed it.
Yeah. And that's part of it. And that was some of our hesitation to go away from it is, we are going to miss some of that, that interaction. And, we're going to see how this goes, with a year of telecheck. Or a hybrid year, but I suspect at some point it'll probably go almost all to telecheck. I think we'll probably still have some aspect of some of our offices being open.
Sure.
In the future we'll just see how it all goes, how this year works. But It's something we'll evaluate.
Yeah, I could see. Well, I've heard or I've seen online the mixed opinions of it. People said basically that, Nathan, that were like, I enjoyed taking my kids there. And so I can definitely see it, but I can also see the opposite. When you're talking about the sand hills, you have to drive 90 minutes. That would be quite a bit of a burden on you.
Yeah. Well,
so I totally get that. Yeah.
Yeah. You look at Highway 2 and it's an hour between Alliance and Hyannis.
That's true.
And that's if you're on,
that's true.
if you're on Highway 2, if you're, anywhere north or south of that, then that, that just adds to it. And that's a long ways to haul a deer.
Now, I'm curious, like from the data collection side of things, will that affect your guys' ability then because you're not able to get some data from those? Or are you still going to, like you mentioned, like probably you would still in the future, like from example, like CWD, you would still probably be sampling, you still have some locations that would be open. So you could still collect that type of data.
Yep. We'll still try to collect CWD data or samples, and if we end up coming up short, we'll just have to adjust. There's a ton of states that get way more samples than we do.
Yeah.
Without mandatory check stations.
Okay. Yeah.
Just volunteer drop-off places, or go to a mandatory submission type of thing. If you kill a deer, then we got to get your sample or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We want to avoid going to mandatory type stuff.
Sure.
We want to give people the freedom. We don't have to tell them.
Yeah.
But we'll figure out ways to keep that going. One of the things we're going to miss is that age, that tooth wear and replacement. That's one thing. That was my biggest heartburn about it. But then looking at the data, our age structure has remained really pretty steady over about the last 8 or 9 years. For the longest, since the late 90s, the percent yearling buck has just slowly been going down and down and down. It was 20, 25 years ago. The mule deer harvest was 85% yearling buck, and now it's completely reversed to about 10% yearling buck. But that's been consistent. But the last 8 years, it fluctuates 1 or 2%. And even with the 2 and 3 year old, that's leveled off. And we've seen similar trends, not quite as drastic. On the whitetail side, it was about 80% yearling buck, between 70 and 80% yearling buck, and now it's 20% yearling buck. So with it, what I'm saying is that those have leveled out. That graph has leveled out. There's not a whole lot of change, and so it's like, well, we can still get the yearling buck number out of it, and we'll still probably sample enough deer to get a statewide estimate of 1, 2, and 3 plus. But beyond that, and if it's something that we're really interested in, we can always ask for tooth submissions and which would give it, then we can do the cement manuali and get an actual age instead of putting them in those classes.
Yeah,
so
that's really interesting.
So with yearling buck harvest dropping off, it sounds like maybe hunters are being a little more selective, or
right. Yeah, and that's we as biologists, we'd all think like it's due to something that we're doing, implementing, but no, it's hunters have just learned that, hey, if I pass him, there's a good chance I'll see him next year.
Sure.
And just as hunters have learned and grown, over the years, there's just been, there's a bigger focus on trophy quality and all that type of stuff. And just hunters are more willing to pass deer.
Now, how does that play into like the CWD? I know some of the research out of, over in Colorado and Fort Collins and such is that, with the age structure, because wasn't it some of the older bucks that they were noticing that prevalence in, and has that, how does that kind of equate into any of the decisions that you guys have?
Yeah, and so there has been some research that's shown that the prevalence in older age class bucks tends to be higher than in does and in younger bucks, and some of that's just a function of they've been on the landscape longer.
Yeah,
adult bucks are very social animals, especially during the rut. So there's all sorts of those factors. There's some research that suggests that if you increased your buck harvest, then you can potentially decrease that prevalence. That's a tricky thing to implement, to convince hunters. Yeah, we need to shoot all the bucks to reduce the prevalence. And there's some places in Colorado where they're actually implementing some of those practices. I don't know that we've necessarily taken any of the steps to do that. That's a tricky thing, especially when hunters are wanting to manage for older bucks and all that. So,
well, I think bottom line too is that just enjoy getting outdoors. I see too often, unfortunately, on social media, it's like, somebody shoots a small buck and it's like, well, we should let it grow. It's like, well, if that made you happy, go out and shoot it. And, as long as it's legal, enjoy the time of field. I think that's the biggest thing, the connection. So
it's your permit and your happiness, and you're the only one that you have to answer to.
Yep.
So do you guys have any data on the typical breakdown from year to year for as far as fawns harvested, does, bucks?
So this past year in 23, for our harvest, we were about 65% of our harvest was bucks, which is generally, and that's on the whitetail side. And then, of that other 35%, about 15 to 20% of that was fawns. 15 to 20% fawns, makes up our antlerless harvest. That's pretty common. That's in that ballpark every year. The antlerless harvest this past year was lower. It tends to be, more in the, low to mid 40s with us reducing our antlerless harvest and antlerless permits the last couple of years. And again, this year, it's just going to make up a smaller percentage of our overall harvest. So, but usually, we're harvesting, for every doe we shoot, we're shooting 1 or 1.5 bucks,
So when you mentioned lower 40%, you're saying the river antlerless season makes up 40% of our total harvest?
No, just the antlerless harvest makes up 40% of the total harvest. The river antlerless, I'd have to look that up. That accounts for probably a quarter of our total harvest, our antlerless harvest across the state. Last year, I'm thinking there's probably about 4,000 deer, and we had taken on that permit, and we had about 12,000 total antlerless deer taken. So I think probably somewhere in that ballpark.
Okay.
So
what does the breakdown from harvest method look like as far as bow, rifle, black powder?
So yeah, each year, about 80% of our harvest is firearm, and that's statewide. About 14 is archery, which is crossbow and vertical archery combined. Yeah, crossbow is about 3 to 4%, and vertical bow is about 10% of our total harvest. And then muzzleloader is between 6 and 7%.
Okay.
So in muzzleloader harvest, the last 10 years has kind of tapered off. It kind of peaked in the late 2000s. And it's kind of tapered off a bit as the, percentage of the harvest.
People don't want to get out in the cold.
Yeah. I'm not real sure what's
really
all
cold
behind that,
winter days, in December you get. No, but yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and obviously you get quite a few, especially in the next upcoming 9 days, you'll get quite a few checks and check-ins. So it should be interesting.
Yeah, and just to note, this episode will actually come out in January. Yep. So that's kind of why we're focusing on the river antlerless season. So obviously rifle season will have passed, but you guys lowered permit numbers this year because lower deer numbers or? Right.
And that was just with where that river antlerless permit specifically, that quota has been 12,000 for about the last 10 years, which it hadn't sold out. It's sold between 8,000 and 9,500 permits. And we recognize that it was kind of, at this point, a functionally unlimited permit because we had never sold it out. And so there were always permits sitting there until the very last day of the season. And we were to the point, last year made us recognize that we were to the point where we needed to probably put a cap on that. We didn't need to have just unrestricted harvest across all of our that river zone. And so we actually cut that quota from 12,000 down to 6,000. Now that's feels like a huge cut, cutting it in half. But last year we only sold 8,000 permits. Oh. So going from 8,000 down, we cut the permit by 25%. Yeah, that was, a fairly major cut. But we also, the other part of it too, is we cut off a lot of the rivers in the western part of the state. We cut off the North and South Platte rivers entirely, all the way down to the confluence there at North Platte. There was several areas in the Panhandle, several little tributaries that you would not call a river, going across the Ogallala grasslands and, some areas like that where we wanted to increase, antlerless whitetail harvest on private lands, which that's the point of that permit is an option for, especially for landowners that have got too many whitetails, an option so that it can assist them in managing deer on their ground on those private lands.
Yeah, that makes sense.
As far as just the regular rifle season in those units, was it an overall reduction as well?
Yeah.
Across the state.
Many of almost all of our unit permits were reduced in quota as well, or if If they didn't come down for this year, they probably came down last year and the year before.
Well, I'm sure the drought didn't help a whole lot the past couple of years. I know I saw, especially last year, I remember all the comments of people saying, I'm not seeing any deer. And I think things have, at least, anecdotally, what I've seen thus far, things have improved this year. I'm sure it ebbs and flows, depends on where you're at. But again, I'm sure it didn't help a whole lot. So,
yeah, there's definitely pockets where deer are doing just fine. We've had handful of people, a friend of mine that hunts on the Platte River, northeast of Grand Island. He's like, I don't know why you guys are reducing deer permits anywhere, but their place, they're seeing a lot of deer, but he knows that there's a lot of parks across the rest of the state where it's struggling. And so, it is trying to find that balance, and that's like with this river antlerless permit, the first year for that permit was in 2012, but a lot of our antlerless only, which we used to call those season choice areas, a lot of those were oriented around river corridors. There was a number of them that, some of the early ones were on the Platte, where it was within 3 miles of the Platte, all the way to Fremont or Columbus, and then, another section in the central Platte, and, doing something along the Republican River. And I think over time, then in 2012, they're like, okay, we need to to consolidate this and just do one permit rather than, splitting those all apart and, trying to, have all those high enough, because at that, in those years prior to 2012, our deer numbers were really high. Mm-hmm. And so, they were trying to set those permits, so they basically didn't sell out anyway. And so they're like, well, if we don't want them to sell out, it's just, it doesn't matter. So,
And the goal of this river antlerless tag, you mentioned it has to be within 3 miles of a designated river system on private land. The goal of that is to reduce numbers where they're really high, right? And you might be seeing problems with crop depredation. And
and that's one of the things we found, is that pretty much all of our whitetail depredation complaints occur within this this zone within the unit. And of course, the unit boundaries are flexible. That's another thing that we look at annually.
Oh, sure.
We most commonly add areas to it, across, like particularly the northern part of the state along the Niobrara River. We added a bunch of those little tributaries, south of the river, over the last 5 or 8 years. And so we tend to add, historically, we've almost always added to it.
Sure.
It's only been these last few years. 2 years ago, I think we removed the entire Republican stretch through the Frenchman out of it. That was kind of the first one where a river stretch had been taken out of it. And that's just simply because the number of whitetail deer along the Republican had been reduced. And, we even had landowners that, 5 or 8 years previous were telling us, hey, we have way too many deer. We're telling us, hey, you got to do something. We don't have any deer.
Oh, wow.
And so it's like, okay, then if we're at that point, then we don't need this extra permit, because that was their point, is like, well, we don't need extra harvest here.
Sure.
But you've got all these extra tags that are still valid here, so we needed to, it's something we need to step back and regulate then.
And I think it's important to note that you're using an adaptive management strategy, right? You're willing to add areas, but you're also willing to take away. When you hear from landowners, hey, we're not having the deer, we're not seeing the deer numbers.
Yeah. Well, that was literally the phrase I was getting ready to say, adaptive management, because that was, that to me really speaks to the agencies. You're willing to listen to people out there to make those decisions, and then obviously using some science behind that to make that. But again, you're holding those meetings annually to get that feedback. That's really interesting. Yeah. Yep. And that's with our permit quotas and some of those boundaries, we do try to be really flexible with that. Making structural changes is a lot bigger task and a bigger change. But with those quotas, we can be really nimble with it. I mean, of course, we always feel like we're a year behind or something, but that's just the nature of it.
Yeah. Easier said than done.
Because I'm sure you get people that say, well, are they hearing what we're talking about? Right. And I think the other challenge is, you have a lot of people out there. Everybody has their own opinions on how things should be done. And that's one of the challenges just in wildlife management as a whole. Yep. But, at the end of the day, you make the, decisions, the best decisions you can with the information you have, and kind of go forward. So in other words, you're never going to be able to make everybody necessarily happy with the decisions, but that's what you got to do.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, for sure.
So with that river antlerless season, it sounds like you've maybe completed the objective of lowering deer numbers in certain areas of the state. So those have since been removed from eligible river systems. Have you seen a reduction in depredation requests from landowners then?
Yeah, yes and no. We've had some stretches where we've definitely seen reductions, like like I said, the Republican stretch in the Frenchman, or I should say the Frenchman portion of the Republican River. Where 10 years ago we had a pile of depredation complaints and damage permits issued. We have virtually none there. But there are some parts of the state where our depredation complaints have increased these last few years. Part of that is also due to just our staff outreach. We've actually 3 years ago we created a depredation program. We had never had a depredation program where we've got a program manager and biologists that specifically focus on depredation. I think we're up to 4 biologists and the program manager now, which we had never had. All those duties were done by the district staff, the district supervisor and the field, or the district manager and the field biologists. And so this has added to our capacity to respond to landowners. So the number of complaints, we've kind of generated our own, just with that we've generated some of those by, asking the landowners if they need help and doing that type of stuff and encouraging them to contact us. But we try to, evaluate that number with that context too. We don't just go, oh, well, they're up, so we've got to, increase permits. Sure, well, it's like, no, we went and knocked on that guy's door, and types of things like that. So, some of it's, some of it we did have, I know this year there's a few places where we've had more depredation complaints. I think, like along the Big Blue River and some of the central or eastern parts of the Platte River, we've seen a few more. We've seen an uptick, compared to the last couple of years. And those are some places where whitetail numbers are doing really pretty good.
So when I'm out there working with landowners, I hear quite a few questions, or they bounce ideas off me. One of the concerns that I've heard from landowners is that this antlerless season ends up in a large number of harvested bucks that may be fawns or maybe have lost their antlers. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So actually, this is one of those being flexible and getting comments from the public. This was probably December of 22 or 21. I had somebody, bring that question to me, who called me on the phone, and I was like, well, yeah, we don't really know. And I was telling him how I was kind of estimating some of that stuff. And he's like, well, why don't you just ask on the inside spread question? Oh yeah, that's genius. And so I messaged our people that, managed our data there, and they added it that afternoon, so you can record whether or not it's a shed buck. In there. If you do shoot an adult male on an antlerless permit, you can report it as a shed buck, because we're looking, okay, I was looking at some of it like, well, there's, it's got a, what do they write, less than, more than, when there's no antlers. So we've started looking at that, and in 23, there was a total of 107 whitetail bucks shot that were categorized as shed bucks. And so the number is really quite low. It's going to happen. And it happens in December. There's bucks that shed early, and so there's a few of those that happen. But it's not nearly as prevalent. That makes up about like half a percent of the total bucks shot in the state. Are shot as shed bucks, and it's less than 1% of the total antlerless deer. So it's a really pretty low number overall. So the impact there is pretty minimal. It's one of those things that it's in my eyes, it's part of the cost of doing business, having a late antlerless season, which is the most convenient time to harvest antlerless deer. When they're hitting food sources and all the other stuff is out of the way. It's an opportunity. You're not trying to crowd in, places where people might be hunting a buck with muzzleloader. Landowners tend to be really welcoming to let hunters in, there in January. So it works really quite well. And a lot of states, you look across the nation, and more states than not have a January antlerless season for all those same reasons.
So would it be safe to say the outlook for that season is good? We'll continue to have it here in Nebraska?
Yeah, I would say I don't see it going away. It's been very successful, and like I said, it's a very useful tool in helping us deal with those whitetail depredation issues. And so it's been, it's a lower price permit. It's pretty cheap. for 2 deer, and it really helps people manage deer on their private land.
And honestly, it's been one of my family's favorite seasons, just from a filling the freezer standpoint. Like you said, cheap tags, landowners are more willing to let you out there. So it's a friendly season, in my opinion, when you get into January.
Yep, for sure.
So what's the outlook for the deer population look like then, just in general?
Well, hopefully we're in a building stage at this point, or a slow build. Some places I think people are hoping they build a little quicker. And there's places that whitetails can rebound really quick. Sure. 5-6 years ago, our landowners, told us that we had too many deer, and so we had ramped, our antlerless permits up. And we did that. It was immediately followed by, basically we're year 4 of a drought at this point. And starting in 20, everything kind of dried up, and it's been really quite dry. We were, I think, really hoping that it had broke this last winter. It kind of appeared to, and then all of a sudden it quit raining about July 1st. So, it's been hard to shake that. And that drought, it increases the likelihood of EHD events. That was what was the cause of the big drop in 2012 when we had that big event, and we probably lost 40% of our deer statewide. But these last few years with the drought, it's hard on everything, because, with the drought, there's less vegetation out there for browse. It's also, less hiding, cover for fawn. So your fawn production is lowered. The deer populations aren't as resilient to doe harvest. And so it was all that stuff. We ramped things up, and then we couldn't throw the brakes on quick enough. And there was also some hesitation. It's like, well, what if the drought breaks,
Oh, sure.
And then we're right back where we were with deer storming back. And so we've, like I said, we always feel like we're a year behind, because it's like, well, what if, you hate to make a big jump, but like this last year we did make a pretty big jump with where we cut our antlerless permits. I think the overall antlerless tags, we reduced about 38% from 23 numbers for this year. So, a lot of permits that had a bonus tag on them, a lot of those bonus tags were taken off, and, reductions in permit quotas and all that. So.
Yeah, drought's definitely a very frustrating factor, because, stuff's getting released for emergency hang and grazing. Yep. So like you said, that hurts bird numbers. It just hurts wildlife across the board. So.
Yeah, well, and the other side of it too, from the landowner side, they're pinched more. Sure. Just with, yields are lower, so their tolerance for deer damage is going to be lower. And so it kind of compounds itself with all that. And we totally get it. It's trying to balance all those desires. It makes it tough. But yeah, drought, of all the things, drought is really, we got no control over it. And
I think that's the big importance of adaptive management, because you have to really be adaptive. Every year is going to be different, and you got to be able to make some of those changes. And of course, maybe it's, a couple years till some of the, bigger changes may take place, but still you're constantly looking at that information to make those decisions. And you mentioned the landowners. Yeah, sure. Like they obviously, I'm sure that tolerance is adjusted in those years. And so you got to constantly reflect that with those permit numbers. Right. So yeah. It's interesting.
So one of my last questions before we wrap up here, you mentioned kind of kicking off some research maybe in the future, and we don't need to dive into it too deep, but did you have any specific research questions that you're interested in looking at?
So some of it, kind of like I've mentioned, is, looking at doe survival, and, some habitat use, and are they, particularly around our river systems, are they moving out of the rivers, at different times of the year? Or is it, are river corridors, are they a wintering area? How do the deer, utilize those habitats, on an annual basis, even, seasonal and daily basis? Or, how many miles out of the river are they moving overnight to go feed?
I'd love to know that. I've always wondered when you're hunting, like, where are these deer coming from? Some of them, especially during the rut, obviously the bucks are moving quite a bit. Yeah. But still, you're like, how far away are some of these deer moving? You just don't really have a good idea about that, especially these fragmented landscapes. So. Yep.
And not to beat a dead horse, but when drought's factored into it, those deer are leaving areas that don't have water because they need to. Right. So that would definitely be interesting.
Yeah, I think that one year, it must have been maybe 2020, the one property I was hunting, they had no water. Mm-hmm. And it was amazing because you could hear where all the shots were coming from during rifle, and it was around all the creeks and streams around that area. So, yeah.
Well, Luke, we greatly appreciate you joining us, and this has been very informative for me, and I hope the listeners as well.
I really appreciate you coming on, and
thanks for having me.
Love to have you come back on in the future and talk about some other things. We got a lot of other big game species as well, and talk about them.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, and let me know, and I'll come back and talk about deer too. So.
Okay. No, that sounds good. Well, thanks again. We really appreciate it.
Of course.
Yes, sir. Thank you, and good luck to everybody out there hunting this year, and be safe.
Yep, absolutely.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks again.
Wild Ag is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. If you enjoy this podcast, please leave us a review so others can find us and tune in.
And we want to hear from you. You can submit questions or topic suggestions to us at wildagpodcast@gmail.com. That's WILDAG podcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.